Hello and welcome to Wineskins, a program featuring reflections on the lives of the saints and the sacred scriptures, along with a variety of topics and issues from a Catholic perspective. I'm your host, Father Jim Corda. Our show is sponsored by the Annual Bishop's Appeal, the Catholic Communication Campaign, and St. Paul's Catholic Books and Gifts, a division of the Society of St. Paul. On our show today, I will interview Father Jeff Michler from the Society of St. Paul. We will also hear more about the life of St. Padre Pio and the readings for this 25th Sunday in Ordinary Time. That and more on Wineskins. With me now is Dr. Shannon D. Williams, who is the Assistant Professor of History at Villanova University in Pennsylvania. It's such a pleasure, Dr. Williams, to have you on Wineskins.
Thank you so much for having me.
You know, when I have the folks in for the First Friday Club for the interview, I'm always intrigued by the title of their presentation because I think there's something unique about the title, but also something very telling about what the topic's going to be about. And your title is The Real Sister Act. I love those two movies. I don't know if it has anything to do with that, but what does the Sister Act and Whoopi Goldberg have to do with your presentation?
It has everything to do with my presentation. Although I am a cradle Catholic, the only Black sister that I ever knew growing up was actually Sister Mary Clarence, who was Whoopi Goldberg's character in the Sister Act franchise. I had never learned about the history of Black Catholic sisters, and I was actually in graduate school at Rutgers when I first encountered that history. I was actually in desperate search for a paper topic for a seminar. And I had started going through microfilmed editions of newspapers looking for topics. And I stumbled upon an article from 1968 announcing the formation of the National Black Sisters Conference. And more than the title, it was the image of 4 smiling Black nuns under it that stayed my hand on the microfilm reader. And it was in that moment that I experienced what I can only call a metanoia. How did I not know about this history? And I was intrigued and I wanted to know more. And that's really how the project began, with me wanting to know more about that organization, about the women who founded it, and the larger history of Black Catholic sisters in the United States.
You know, it's interesting when we talk about that in our history, a lot of people are not aware that there were African Americans, there are, who are in religious life, who are priests, who are brothers. Why is it that people might be unaware of that?
I think oftentimes when we think about the Black religious experience in the United States, we think about the Protestant story. The vast majority of African American Christians are Protestant, over 90%. That being said, we also know that the first Black articulation of Christianity in what becomes the United States is Catholicism. When we think about Spanish Florida and the formation of St. Augustine, but also thinking about the women and men who became the nation's earliest Black sisters and priests. Many of them can trace their lineage to the earliest days of the church, to colonial Maryland, to colonial Louisiana. And so many of these individuals have birthrights to the early American church and the African Americans who, as free and enslaved members, built it.
You know, it's interesting when we talk about vocations in the 21st century in the American church right now, we know that those are dwindling, unfortunately. Are they dwindling also among minorities as well? What is your estimation on that?
Well, what's interesting is we've seen a revitalization, I think, or a growth in the number of vocations from women of African descent in the United States, in part because of immigration from the global South. And so on the one hand, we see a rise in the Black sister population. Now I think the African American Catholic population is roughly 3% of the total Catholic population. But if we look at the numbers in female religious life, we're up to 7%, which is huge, but that is being driven by immigration. Many of the vocations in the earlier periods, quite frankly, were perhaps not as nurtured as we would like to think that they should have been in the early church. So on the one hand, we know that there are Black sisters among the earliest Catholic sisters in the nation, and yet we also know that there were policies that barred African Americans from pursuing their vocations or restricted them in ways that oftentimes discouraged vocations.
You know, it's interesting you were talking about that. I call to mind the Diocese of Youngstown celebrated its 75th anniversary this year. And in our history, there was a Black priest who was sent here from another state who was not, unfortunately, well received. And so that history that is part of that life is also part, sadly, of our history. Why are those stories something that we need to lift up to understand that that has to be a better part of our history.
I think if the church wants to reckon with its own history, not only of slavery, but of segregation, then we have to begin to tell those stories. When I began interviewing members of the historically Black sisterhoods, which were organized in the United States in response to the exclusionary admissions policies of their white counterparts, I began to learn a story that I had never heard first when I began researching this history. I naturally assumed that the members of the historically Black orders had been educated by those same communities. What I learned time and time again was, oh no, I was educated by this order of white sisters. They were my primary and high school educators, but then I was told that I would not be allowed to enter that community, and I was tracked to the Black communities. And so when I began to recognize that earlier history of racial segregation, you begin to think about what it took for these women to oftentimes travel hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles away from their hometowns to enter a community that was willing to accept them. For me, what's really important about these stories is that they typify what scholars have often described as the uncommon faithfulness of the African American Catholic community, that people have remained loyal even in the face of discrimination. And that's what's really powerful about that story. Indeed, for me, what I would say is the story of the Real Sister Act is the story of how generations of African American women and girls called to religious life, fought against racial segregation and exclusion to be able to pursue their vocations as sisters. And I think that's a wonderful story, and I think our church needs to hear those stories in new and important ways.
Dr. Shannon D. Williams, unfortunately our time is up, but I thank you for enlightening us, but also for being present here and lifting up the Real Sister Act for us here in the greater Youngstown area. And we hope to have you back again on Wineskins real soon.
Thank you so much.
For Wineskins, I'm Father Jim Corda. The Feast of Padre Pio is celebrated on Monday. To tell us more about this holy priest is Sister Joyce Candidi. She is the director of the Office of Religious and a member of the Oblate Sisters of the Sacred Heart of Jesus.
Francesco, named in honor of St. Francis of Assisi, was born to parents who were peasant farmers in the small Italian village of Petralcina on May 25, 1887. From his childhood, Francesco was very devout and at an early age felt drawn to the priesthood. At the age of 15, he joined the Capuchins and became a novice a year later. He received the habit in 1902 and was ordained to the priesthood in 1910 after 7 years of study, becoming known as Padre Pio. In 1917, he was assigned to the friary in San Giovanni Rotondo, 75 miles from the city of Bari on the Adriatic. On September 20th, 1918, Padre Pio was kneeling in front of a large crucifix when he had a vision of Jesus. When the vision ended, he had the stigmata, the visible marks of the crucifixion, in his hands, feet, and side, making him the first stigmatized priest in the history of the Church. Life became more complicated after that. Medical doctors, church authorities, and curiosity seekers came to see Padre Pio. In 1924, and again in 1931, the authenticity of the stigmata was questioned. Padre Pio was not permitted to celebrate Mass publicly or to hear confessions. He did not complain of these decisions, which were soon reversed. However, he wrote no letters after 1924. His only other writing, a pamphlet on the agony of Jesus, was done before 1924. Padre Pio rarely left the friary after he received the stigmata, but busloads of people soon began coming to see him. Each morning after a 5 a.m. Mass in a crowded church, he heard confessions until noon. He took a mid-morning break to bless the sick and all who came to see him. Every afternoon he also heard confessions. In time, his confessional ministry would take 10 hours a day. Penitents had to take a number so that the situation could be handled. Many of them have said that Padre Pio knew details of their lives that they had never mentioned. Padre Pio saw Jesus in all the sick and suffering. At his urging, a fine 350-bed hospital was built on nearby Mount Gargano. The idea arose in 1940. A committee began to collect money. Ground was broken in 1946. Building the hospital was a technical wonder because of the difficulty of getting water there and of hauling up the building supplies. One of Padre Pio's sufferings was that unscrupulous people several times circulated prophecies that they claimed originated from him. He never made prophecies about world events and never gave an opinion on matters that he felt belonged to the church authorities to decide. Upon his death on September 23, 1968, the wounds were no longer visible. In fact, there was no scarring, and the skin was completely renewed. He had predicted 50 years prior that upon his death, the wounds would heal. The wounds of the stigmata were not the only mystical phenomenon experienced by Padre Pio. The blood from the stigmata had an odor described by many as similar to that of perfume or flowers. Padre Pio had the ability to read the hearts of the penitents who flocked to him for confession, which he heard for 10 or 12 hours per day. Padre Pio used the confessional to bring both sinners and devout souls closer to God. He would know just the right word of counsel or encouragement that was needed. He died on September 23, 1968, at the age of 81. His funeral was attended by about 100,000 people. He was beatified in 1999 and canonized in 2002. For Wineskins, I'm Sister Joyce Candidi.
I'm talking with Father Jeff Michler of the Society of St. Paul. You know, prior to the break, we started to talk about the marriage of the Society of St. Paul and the Diocese of Youngstown coming together in this wonderful facility, sharing the good news through modern telecommunications technology. So let's talk about that marriage that took place in 1983. What was going on in other dioceses around the country in the area of communications?
First of all, I want to say that when I was a novice here in 1966, I really got God's attention by saying, well, I better get my writing and editing skills together because we're never going to be in radio or television. It's just too costly and impossible. When you say something like that to God, God's going to prove you wrong. And when Bishop Malone approached us, we jumped at the chance of setting up CTNY, the Ecumenical Television Chapel, on our property. The bishops nationwide were trying to do something as well. And there was a question of whether the network should be simply a network or a telecommunications system where local chanceries could participate in conference calls, etc. The Youngstown Diocese here, in collaboration with us, I think has proved to be one of the most successful of all the dioceses. I mean, there are some very good things. Fresno has its own television station, a standalone broadcast station. Brooklyn, Boston, Telecare in Long Island. After that, though, it starts getting very thin, but we're still standing and still growing in the programming we're producing. And that has to be the product of the Holy Spirit.
And I think we should let the folks know and remind them that while CTNY is really kind of the umbrella, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown that kind of oversees the operation, that our service is the Ecumenical Television Channel. And so this ETC channel is ecumenical in attitude and spirit. Why is that important in our apostolates to have that ecumenical approach?
Well, it's at the heart of the teachings of the Vatican Council. It's at the heart of the document on communications and every other document that has come out of the center of the Church, the Vatican, about interreligious and ecumenical cooperation with the Protestant denominations. And it's essential to cultivating a spirit of mutual respect for others, which is truly necessary today more than when it was founded in 1983. There's more and more antagonism between religions, which is proving so destructive.
In your many years with the Society of St. Paul and here in Canfield, what and who are some of those people that have influenced you and influenced the apostolate to bring it to where it is today? We know as we celebrated the anniversary of the Diocese of Youngstown, it was an opportunity to look at those bishops who led us, but also those priests and lay people and sisters who and brothers who really were part of it all and brought us to where we are now in anticipation of perhaps our 100th anniversary.
Well, certainly for me, Bishop Malone was a great influence. He was the one that ordained me in our chapel here. He taught me to smile during the liturgy, which is something we sometimes forget. Father Bob Bono, who was at the founding of the Ecumenical Channel, was a great influence and had great insight into communications. And all of my fellow religious, from Brother Dominic, who immediately jumped in on the forming of the television station, and many others that have participated as camera people, as guests on wineskins, etc. All of us working together, I think, have fed off one another and become stronger because of it.
In this anniversary year of the beginnings of the Society of St. Paul in Canfield, what has been the most blessing in the life of the community, and what have been some of those challenges?
The greatest blessing, of course, is knowing that we're doing the will of God and encouraging people in their own faith life, especially those in this area who are homebound, who are sick, and they appreciate so much, especially the masses that we've produced here. I think also that we have the challenge that every aspect of the church has on vocations. And yet, this is the era of the laity, and we pray that if people don't join the Society of St. Paul, that they may join one of our other branches, like the Annunciationists, the Gabrielites, or even just lay cooperators to keep our apostolate here vibrant and helpful. And the Holy Spirit has so many tricks up his sleeve that I'm certain that there's going to be new avenues opened up that we have not even imagined yet.
Let's talk about your particular input in social communications. You have many followers in the different forms of communication. What are some of those, and how can people follow but also be in tune to the gospel through social media?
In 2006, I started my own YouTube channel with maybe pride or humility. I called it Father Jeffrey, F-A-T-H-E-R-J-F-F-R-E-Y. But now, in conjunction with the diocese, we have over 1,000 videos there that have received responses from New Zealand to Siberia. But then there are other things, like I have the handle Catholic Priest on Instagram, where I post a variety of religious or human photos. I also tweet along as Catholic Priest. I don't get as many tweets as our current president, but I tweet out a few. And these are all ways of communicating back and forth with people that I'll never know or see in this life. But I hope that our efforts here at the Society of St. Paul and the diocese will bear more fruit than we could ever imagine.
In closing, what does St. Paul do for us and tell us about spreading the good news?
St. Paul was completely focused on telling the story of Jesus to the ends of the earth. Nothing else would distract him, and we get so often distracted. We have to tell the world Jesus, our divine master, the way, truth, and life, is at the heart of our salvation and the salvation of the world. And tell it over and over again, but always with a smile on our face and love in our hearts.
Father Jeff Mickler, we thank you and the brothers and priests of the Society of St. Paul for allowing us into your home and allowing us to share your ministry of social communication. And we ask St. Paul, we ask Blessed Alberione to continue to guide and direct us into the way of Christ, to bring that message to the ends of the earth. And thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you. Visit the website of the Catholic Diocese of Youngstown at www.doi.org. Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment.
Christopher Minutes, thoughts on making every day count. Here's Monsignor Jim Lisanti.
On February 3, 1966, U.S. Navy Captain Gerald Coffey was flying a reconnaissance mission off the coast of North Vietnam. When he lost control of his aircraft, he was captured on the ground by North Vietnamese forces. He would spend the next 7+ years in prison. Recalling the experience, the former POW says, "The key to my survival was faith in God above all, but also faith in others and in myself. I learned to appreciate myself and my own humanity." In order to stay focused on his faith, Captain Gerald Coffey created a visual reminder for himself. He says, "The first 2 words I scratched on my cell wall made all the difference. They were 2 words with an equal sign between them. God equals strength." My friends, no matter what your circumstances, you can find strength in God.
Our song today is by Jean Cotter and courtesy of GIAmusic.com. It is from her CD entitled Tender Hearted.
Gospel kindred, how I love thee. Tongue nor pen can never say the very feelings of affection, growing stronger day by day. Together we travel with the gospel, and we bow down to what is true, and tell the world that Christ our Savior is creating things anew.
Our scripture reflections for this 25th Sunday in Ordinary Time will be by Father Sean Conaboy.
What information do people come to you for? We approach each other seeking answers to all sorts of questions. We ask each other for advice. We seek each other out for assurance and consolation in difficulties. You may be the one who everyone asks about something in the past, about history. You may know the details of civics or sports or a particular place. You may have the details of your family history. Or you may have a particular skill, and so you're asked to do some work or to give some insight into solving a problem. We ask each other about relationships and how to be a good person. We ask each other all sorts of questions. We are seeking answers to a variety of questions. And so what information do people ask of you? Of course, a common topic is recipes. Many people share ideas about quick or fancy or special foods. Many people have stories about their family recipes. And some of these, though, get into questions of vague notes and ingredients missing. The story isn't complete. And then there are stories of how the recipe was finally passed along to another who's now bound by that same secrecy. That information is missing as that recipe is shared. We ask each other for all sorts of information. We are asked to share in the things that we know best. And sometimes we will share freely and completely, but sometimes we will withhold something for a lack of trust, for some reason. Sometimes we will even deceive. Of all of the things that you can be asked, be certain that others are asking you about a Christian witness. Even if the question is not put into words, as fellow Christians, we look to each other. Others look to us. They look to see how a Christian responds in this or that situation. to see what behavior is acceptable, to see how to respond to certain information. Again, all of these questions and our answers can be asked and given without the use of words. But of course, sometimes someone does ask a particular question of us about our faith. Maybe it's a question about a teaching or a practice of the church. Maybe it's a question about God and faith. Hopefully we have answers for them, but sometimes we may not be equipped to answer every question. So we should have some references handy. For example, the Catholic Encyclopedia or the Catechism of the Catholic Church, or someone with specialized theological training that we can point them to. But even if we have to point the other person to a reference, we are still responsible for giving the fundamental example of Christian witness. We give that example to them first. St. Paul reminds us that we are stewards of the gospel. We have a message to share, the message of salvation and forgiveness and love. And Jesus' words in today's gospel show us the seriousness of our stewardship. Jesus shows us that as people of faith, we have a message to share. We can either share it well or not. Jesus cannot accept those, like the merchant in the first reading, who work for personal gain. Periodically, we should check that we are sharing the faith and not working against it. We cannot serve two masters. Jesus gives us the opportunity today to take inventory of who we serve. Most of us, most of the time, intend to faithfully share the faith. At home, at work, wherever we find ourselves, we are sharing the faith. Today we are reminded that people come to us for all sorts of information. We are reminded that with or without words, we answer the question of discipleship. And we take the opportunity to assess how well we are doing. Each week in the Eucharist, we ask for an increase in our faithfulness to God and to the message that we share. For Wineskins, I'm Father Sean Conaboy.
We have a wonderful creed. We profess a marvelous faith. What we need to do is line up our lives with Christ's and with what we say we believe. Shakespeare was right when he said, "Consistency, thou art a rare gem." Wineskins is made possible by the annual Bishop's Appeal, the Catholic Communication Campaign, and St. Paul's Catholic Books and Gifts. The program is produced by CTNY, the Catholic Telecommunications Network of Youngstown. I'm your host, Father Jim Corda, wishing you a blessed Sunday and a safe week.
What have you done for your marriage today?
I gave my wife a hug this morning. I told her I love her.
I did her hair this morning. I think it looks pretty good.
I cooked my husband's favorite breakfast.
I bought her an orchid.
What have I done for my marriage today? I sent my husband a love email.
I read the newspaper to my wife, and it cracked her up. But she's still laughing.
What have you done for your marriage today? Make a change for the better. Need help? Go to foryourmarriage.org, a message from the Catholic Church.
They say America is the land of opportunity, but for some, life isn't so easy. Right now in America, 1 in 6 children lives below the poverty line. That's nearly 13 million children of all races, all across our country. Where do you draw the line and get involved? You can make a difference in more ways than you think. Go to povertyusa.org today, because 1 in 6 children in poverty is one too many. A message from the Catholic Campaign for Human Development.